If you ever see a branchless oak tree, walk away. Excluding some tropical species, such as coconut and banana trees, no tree can survive long without branches. However, defying all explanation, I saw a pair of branchless oak trees in the summer of 2015. When I use the word branchless, I'm not referring to a stump. I'm not referring to a tree that has shed its leaves during the winter. No, I'm talking about two 15-foot tall trunks, both sporting identical pointed peaks and surfaces of jagged bark. No branches or leaves. No severed stumps on the trunks that would indicate the old oaks had ever been anything other than monolithic plants. Bizarre, I chuckled. Not necessarily riveting dinner talk, I know. Believe me, I wouldn't be recounting the tale if it had ended there. I chose to follow the overgrown footpath between the two pillars of bark, rather than the well-maintained footpath which led far away from the ominously bare trunks. I've always been difficult, so I wanted to satiate my hungry ego by taking the less trodden path. I'm no tourist, I inwardly scoffed. Hubris always comes before the fall. Or, as my son would say, I had succumbed to main character energy. I wish I'd taken the main path. I waded through leaves and moss, and the undergrowth crunched beneath my walking boots. I had no intended destination in mind. I was just looking for somewhere to set up my base camp. I knew how to retrace my steps. I saw no harm in taking a mystery trail. From time to time, I simply like to separate myself from the world. I venture on solo camping trips to clear my head. My wife and children don't take much interest in nature, so it's not that I purposefully exclude them. Frankly, I'm thankful that they weren't with me on this particular trip. Whilst camping in the middle of a clearing, I was woken by rustling sounds outside my tent. I tried to ignore them, squeezing my eyelids together and angrily attempting to force myself back to sleep. Frustration quickly turned to fear. The noises that encompassed my tent were unlike any I'd ever heard. High-pitched squeals, similar to trainer soles squeaking against a hardwood floor, were emitted from every direction. Heart racing at a tremendous pace, I sat upright and stared at the fragile wall of material that was separating me from whatever unidentifiable things were out there. Very little moonlight reached the clearing, thankfully, so the shadows that danced on the outer fabric of my tent were indistinguishable. That made it easier to tell myself the creatures were simply foxes. They weren't foxes. I knew that. I used string to build a makeshift lock for the zipper on my tent. I didn't want anything opening the door to my vulnerable fortress. After that, I lay down and waited. Piercing, yipping noises eventually died down, but I didn't immediately fall asleep. I intended to stay awake all night, but I must have eventually passed out. Terror can do that to a person. In the morning, I planned to leave the haunting woods and go home. Imagine my horror when I unlocked my tent door to find that I was no longer in the forest clearing. My tent had been moved whilst I slept. More horrifyingly than that, I found myself stuck in a thick cluster of branchless trees. As far as the eye could see, I was surrounded by those eerily wrong oak trunks. I instantly packed my tent and belongings, and then I weaved between the densely packed trees of the new branchless forest. But I'd completely lost my bearings. The branchless forest was the same in every direction. All I could see was endless bark. And when the sun began to fall below the treetops, I realised I'd let the wintry day slip away from me. Night was approaching quickly, but that wasn't what terrified me most. The horrid squeals had returned. As the sun dipped lower and lower, the sounds multiplied and loudened. Before long, the noise was accompanied by rustling bushes. Panic turned me to stone. My walking slowed, and I started to believe I would never leave the forest. I was overwhelmed when I found the stream, my saving grace. I didn't see it on my map, but I didn't have time to think about the terrifying implications of that fact. Every stream has to lead somewhere, even in a landscape of alien oaks. I had no idea which way to walk, so I followed the stream east, trying to ignore the cacophony of squeals and moving shrubbery. I pressed onwards. I was stumbling around in complete darkness, guided only by the dim light of my cheap torch. After an hour of walking, I finally found something promising. A cave. I didn't want to enter it, but I welcomed any sort of landmark that could break the monotony of ceaseless tree trunks. My victorious moment was short-lived, however, as I was interrupted by small, pattering sounds from behind me. I quivered as I twisted around and moved my torchlight towards the source of the noise, finding myself gazing upon a gaggle of 24 tiny, humanoid creatures. Each one was 30 centimeters tall, with 2 ant-like feelers in lieu of eyes and a ghoulish set of black fangs. Each one also had 4 vaguely human arms, along with 2 vaguely human legs. As they walked towards me, the beings dropped forwards and used all 6 limbs to scurry like insects. I backed away slowly, almost too petrified to move. My torch shook violently in my near-numb hand. In a flood of sound and a flash of rapid movement, one of the fiendish things charged for my leg and made quick work of snaking around it. I screamed as the creature began to constrict my limb, cutting off its circulation. The creature's friends released a chorus of seemingly jubilant squeals. I didn't wait for the others to join their brave leader. I ferociously punted the trend-setting creature with the rear end of my torch. And it hissed in pain, uncoiling from my leg. Body shaking in horror, I seized my small window of opportunity and started sprinting towards the cave mouth. The 6-limbed monstrosities pursued me, rapidly closing the gap between us. I expected them to devour me in the entrance, but they stopped. As I fell into the cave, I turned to look at the stationary group of horrifying ant people. They were standing, watching, as if they were too afraid to step inside, and I really should have paid more attention to that. A hiss, like a freshly flipped sand timer, erupted from the deepest point of the cavernous pit. I shuddered, realizing I could either face certain death from the ant people, or I could risk whatever lay within the cave. Not much of a choice, but the latter option seemed preferable. My torch barely illuminated the few yards in front of me, and the hissing creature was entirely silent. The only sound in the cave was that of my echoing footsteps. Even the ant people had ceased their squealing. What did they fear at the heart of that dreadful place? The cave itself was not particularly big. It was more of a room than a home, and I stumbled into the room of the ghastliest thing I've ever seen. The ant people paled in comparison. In the far corner of the cave, roughly 100 feet from the entryway, was a 10-foot tall insect. Well, not an insect. Much like the ant people, it possessed some characteristics of certain insects and arachnids, but this creature was one of a kind. An animal composed of only 6 hairless legs, similar to those of a human. Other than the length and the pointed ends instead of feet. At first glance, it seemed like a spider with 2 missing limbs, but I quickly ascertained that the creature had no discernible body. Its body was its legs. The thing had no head. The 6 limbs met at a central point, but there was no indication of any torso that would contain organs or sensory tools. Nonetheless, the creature certainly lived, and it certainly sensed me. Its half-human limbs started to tentatively crawl towards the source of the torchlight, but I wasn't going to wait for another monster to seize my body and devour it. I scanned the walls of the cave, looking for a hiding spot. In another corner of the room, there was a mound of rocks. If I crawl in there, I might be out of reach, I thought. The 6-legged thing hurtled after me, its limbs making a horrific clicking sound as they galloped across the stones beneath them. Diving through a gap behind the rocks, I slithered out of reach and shone my torchlight onto the creature which lay beyond my rocky fortress. The thing unleashed a menacing howl and proceeded to jab the sharp ends of its fleshy limbs at the holes between the rocks. Fortunately, my stone fort shielded me, but the wait until sunrise was unbearably long. As daylight began to fill the cave, I squinted through the cracks in my rocky wall, and I was fairly certain the ant people had vanished. I could see the entrance. I had a plan. Searching in my rucksack, I found what I needed. A flare. I just had to hope it would scare the monster. Not pausing to rethink my decision, I lit it. The creature wailed in terror, backing into its original corner of the cave to escape the blaze of the flare in my hand. I hurriedly scrambled free of the stone den, keeping the flare in front of me, and I ran to the cave entrance. I followed the stream, and, after hours of walking, I finally found something that briefly stifled the fear in my heart. Trees with branches and leaves. Recognizing my surroundings, I managed to retrace my steps and find the main footpath. This is the first time I've ever mentioned the incident to anyone. I haven't found that forest of branchless trees, the stream, or the cave on any map. I don't know how I stumbled upon it. I don't know how I escaped from it. I only know one thing. If you ever see a branchless oak tree, walk away.